For Andrew Jackson, the central question of his presidency was what he could do to prevent these average Americans from being exploited by the rich and powerful. The answer Jackson hit upon was to destroy an institution that he thought was giving the wealthy an unfair advantage. Its real title was the Second Bank of the United States, but Jackson's supporters called it the Monster Bank.
Andrew Jackson dislikes all banks, he said at one point, but he particularly disliked the Bank of the United States as established by Congress after the War of 1812. The reason was simple. It had too much power outside of any kind of public accountability. The bank was an enormous economic institution. It could really control credit and therefore control the American economy itself. For Jackson, that meant that the American economy was being run by people who were not elected, that these unelected bankers had their hands on the levers of power and could control people's lives, their destinies, and indeed could control the political system itself.
To Jackson, one of the Monster Bank's worst sins was that it was funding new-style businesses that were beginning to wrap their tentacles around both the economy and the government. These new businesses were called corporations.
The problem with corporations, as far as Jackson was concerned, was they had no body to be kicked or soul to be damned. They were faceless, anonymous machines that were motivated only by making profit for their shareholders. And as a result, they could grow much, much larger than the average consumer, the average worker, the average citizen.
But Jackson's opponents thought corporations would help America become more prosperous, and they thought his plan to blow up the bank verged on insanity. For it was the bank that guaranteed that the paper dollars in Americans' wallets were worth something.
Jackson took a kind of fundamentalist view of money and credit. Gold and silver dollars were real money. Paper was in some sense fake. Those who were perhaps more astute economists than Jackson thought that this position was just short of Neanderthal. The United States had been built on credit. As Henry Clay said in the Senate, we have always been a paper money people. We won the revolution on paper money.
Clay and his allies in Congress decided to put some heat on Old Hickory. Near the end of Jackson's first term, they passed a bill extending the bank's charter. Clay calculated that the president would have no choice but to sign the bill because a veto would be seen by the American public as so irresponsible it would cost Jackson re-election. But Clay had made a fundamental miscalculation about the character of Andrew Jackson. A character that was exemplified by an event that took place in the midst of the battle over the bank. At the president's request, a Navy surgeon was brought to the White House to operate on a painful shoulder. The problem was a simple one. There was a bullet in it. 20 years before, during the War of 1812, Major General Jackson became embroiled in a feud between one of his officers and a prominent Nashville family. Instead of mediating the dispute, as might have been expected of a man of his stature, General Jackson took part in a full-scale gun battle. During it, he was shot at point-blank range and almost died. This saga defined the character of Andrew Jackson. He could not pass up a fight, and when he fought, he was willing to risk everything. Of the bank, he declared,
"The bank is trying to kill me, but I will kill it."
On July 10, 1832, Jackson vetoed the bill reauthorizing the bank. The president's address in defense of the veto was perhaps the most important of his life, for he had to explain to the American people, not with bombast, but with words from his heart, why he so fervently opposed the bank.
It is to be regretted that the rich and powerful too often bend the acts of government to their selfish purposes. When the laws undertake to make the rich richer and the potent more powerful, the humble members of society, the farmers, the mechanics, and laborers, who have neither the time nor the means of securing like favors to themselves, have a right to complain of the injustice of their government. We can at least take a stand against any prostitution of our government to the advancement of the few at the expense of the many.
To help rally support for Jackson's re-election campaign in 1832, the president and his closest advisor, Martin Van Buren, came up with one of the boldest strokes in American political history. They founded the Democratic Party.
Jackson thought of the democracy, as it was called. It wasn't called the Democratic Party, it was called the democracy. Thought of it as the association of the vast majority of Americans, the majority that should govern, to make sure that they would govern. There are all sorts of ways in which ordinary people can participate. Jackson thinks that's important because the ordinary people have to associate more because they don't have the resources that the rich and the well-born do.
For years, Jackson's opponents had lampooned his frontier roots by portraying him as a jackass. To their shock, the Jacksonians began embracing the symbol.
Well, the donkey as a symbol of the Democratic Party started out as a satire, as an attack on the rubish, sort of Beverly Hillbillies nature of the Jackson's Democratic Party. But interesting, people like Henry Clay and others didn't quite understand that in urban settings, the donkey may have been a figure of fun, but for people in rural America, which was most of America at the time, the donkey was essential to daily life, and it was someone you could rely on. And Jackson and the Democrats were presenting themselves as people you could rely on.
A second party quickly arose to oppose the Democrats. Called the National Republicans, they chose Jackson's fiercest rival, Henry Clay, to run against him for president.
Henry Clay and Andrew Jackson hated each other. Clay saw himself as a great American statesman and couldn't quite understand how this rube from the Carolina backcountry, who'd never gone to school, who'd never read a book, in Clay's view, could possibly be so powerful and have such a hold over the people, thereby ensuring that Clay himself would never do that, because he didn't appreciate, I think, Jackson's gifts of both charisma and the power of his personality.
During the election campaign, Jackson and his advisors again demonstrated complete mastery of the media tools available to them.
This man was sitting for his portrait again and again and again. Jackson had a sense that I want the American people to know me and to know what I look like. And I think that says something about his political sense. He's a first in many ways, and he's the first president that I know who had a desire to use the media to communicate with the American people.
On Election Day, voters flocked to the polls in record numbers. And thanks to Jackson's reputation as a military hero and his continuing expansion of America, They gave Old Hickory a landslide victory. But what Andrew Jackson read into the victory was that he now had a mandate to destroy the Bank of the United States. And so the president ordered the government's money removed from the bank. But even some in his own cabinet thought such a step was illegal, and Jackson had to replace 2 Treasury secretaries before finding a third who would obey him.
Nothing like this would happen again until Richard Nixon, during the Watergate crisis, had to go through 3 attorneys general to find one who would fire Archibald Cox as special prosecutor.
On the floor of the U.S. Senate, Henry Clay asserted that nothing less than the future of American democracy was at stake.
We are in the midst of a revolution, hitherto bloodless, but rapidly tending toward the concentration of all power in the hands of one man.
For the only time in American history, the Senate censured the president. People throughout the nation began calling it the Bank War. It was a war in which reason and economics were the casualties, and the chief combatants were Jackson and the president of the bank, Nicholas Biddle.
The confrontation between Andrew Jackson and the Bank of the United States escalated, you might almost say, beyond the bounds of sanity. From the point of view of Nicholas Biddle, president of the Bank of the United States, this maniac president was going to destroy the American economy. And both sides got so wrapped up in it that they did reckless things. Nicholas Biddle, in an effort to procure a recharter, actually triggered what was called a panic in those days, a stock market crash and a brief depression, not realizing that in doing this he was proving every point Jackson made about the reckless power that the Bank of the United States held over ordinary Americans' lives.
Finally, in 1836, the bank's charter expired and its doors were closed, and Andrew Jackson once again emerged from a battle victorious.
An historian has written that every once in a while in American history, it becomes necessary to save American capitalism from the capitalists, that left to their own devices, they will so accrete power that they will end up ruining the economy. Well, Jackson in some ways saw that was the beginning of that process, as American capitalism was just beginning to develop. He saw that to keep the system going in a democratic fashion, as he saw it, it was necessary that accountability had to be there in the system in a way that it did not seem to be as of 1832.
Jackson's battles during his second term in office were not just political. One afternoon, as the president was leaving the Capitol, a mentally ill man who believed that Jackson had killed his father approached him. The explosion of the pistol's percussion cap convinced bystanders that the president had been shot. But the gunpowder inside the pistol failed to ignite. The assailant then drew a second pistol and fired point blank into the president's chest. Miraculously, the powder inside the second gun also failed to ignite. As a result, Andrew Jackson survived the first assassination attempt ever against an American president. Then, in the presidential election of 1836, Jackson's hand-picked successor, Martin Van Buren, rode Old Hickory's coattails to victory. On March 4th, 1837, Andrew Jackson's tumultuous presidency came to an end. In a sign of the remarkable changes that had taken place during his years in office, he left Washington not in a carriage pulled by horses, as he had arrived 8 years before, but on a train car pulled by a steam-powered locomotive. To a reporter, Jackson said,
After 8 years as president, I have only 2 regrets: that I have not shot Henry Clay or hanged John C. Calhoun.